Hi there, welcome to this Module 10 clarification question video. Uh, we're going to talk about a couple of questions here, the two most popular questions that you asked. One of them was by Ariana Morales, and she says the chapter stated that guerrillas have often been able to fight for years and inflict great losses. This reminds me of concepts discussed in the previous chapter concerning terrorism. My question is, what's the difference? What is the difference between guerrilla warfare, and terrorism? I think that's a good question because I think Max Boot, who we read on guerrilla warfare, doesn't do a great job of separating the two. It looks like sometimes he talks about them in the same breath as sort of similar. For example, like early on in the chapter, he talks about, he's okay in Syria, in Mexico. Oh, and then we've also seen terrorist attacks from 9/11 suicide from 9/11 to suicide bombings in Iraq. Um, and so he's talking about them at the same time, but he is using different terms. Right? He's in guerrilla warfare, terrorism. Later on, he talks about the IRA as an example of guerrilla warfare, right? Which seems like a terrorist group. At least that's how they're characterized in the British media. And so the difference between them, I think we can cobble together some argument about there being a difference from what he's written, but I think it's not altogether clear what the distinction is that he's making. But he does make distinctions at various points, right? He does talk about the terrorism is a weapon of the weakest forces. Guerrilla warfare is a weapon of the sort of slightly stronger forces, and then conventional armies are what the strong forces use, right? So, and he even talks about how the same groups of people, I think he mentions the Turks and the Mongols, they employed guerrilla tactics early on, but once they became powerful, right, they switched to conventional armies. So there is he does have a distinction there somehow, right? Because he's distinguishing between different tactics used by different groups of people or by the same group of people over different periods in their history. As they become stronger, they sort of move from terrorism to guerrilla warfare. So he does want there to be a distinction and a difference, and he does make that sometimes. But definitely having read your question and sort of said, oh, that's a good question, and going back through and looking, I can't quite put my finger on what the distinction is. I tried a couple of things in my mind. One of the things I tried is I thought, well, one of the hypotheses I sort of briefly considered was, maybe terrorist acts, and terrorist organizations are dealt with by law enforcement agencies, whereas guerrilla warfare is fought by militaries, right? So, because he does start early on talking about sort of the recency, right, the 7,000 year history, but of irregular, unconventional forces fighting conventional forces, right? So he says that's been going on since I think 5,000. Let's say 5,000 years or 5,000 BC. Anyway, several thousand years at least. So. So that might be one way to do it. Like, okay, so who are they fighting? Who are the terrorists fighting? The other thing I thought was, the first hypothesis is from the terrorist chapter we had, the terrorists are often targeting civilians, right? Much softer targets. Maybe guerrilla warriors are targeting military. But he says early on in Max Boot says early on that guerrilla war sometimes targets civilians as well. So that distinction goes away as well. So these are distinctions that I would, for shorthand, I would go to, okay, who are they fighting? Are they fighting the military? Are they fighting, is it being dealt with by law enforcement? Are they targeting civilian, or are they targeting more clearly sort of elements of the state, like the military and perhaps as well government officers and that sort of thing, which might be more civilian targets. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question that I think you have to sort of build an answer to from Max Boot, but it's not one that he clearly gives us, right? Oftentimes, again, like oftentimes I'm still looking at the reading for answers, right? I'm seeing number 9, technology has been relatively unimportant in guerrilla war, but may be changing. All guerrilla and terrorist tactics, right? He seems to be lumping them together there, right? So sometimes he's lumping them together, and sometimes he's pushing them apart. At some points, I think maybe it's a matter of degrees, right? How big is the terrorist force? How hard are the targets that they're able to attack? That's another way of maybe thinking about it, and distinguishing them between terrorism and guerrillas, terrorists and guerrillas. But yeah, I mean, it seems like part of it might deal with the the reaction of the state. Like, does the state send the military after them and fight them like an army? Can they behave like an army? So remember, right? They're not conventional forces. They're not going to sort of stand in formation with uniforms on, and which is why they look like terrorists, right? They're not going to stand in formation, but maybe they're on the way to that, right? So they might have. Maybe we look at the structure of. If we think of the structure of terrorist groups, especially the more sort of recent ones, more Middle Eastern ones like Al Qaeda. Right? Well, if you think of Al Qaeda, you've got these cells that are operating independently of one another, without any sort of central organization. Right? We might look at that. We might say, okay, a guerrilla's more organized along military lines. Are they a nascent military, like a paramilitary, where they'd have a central organization? Then you would maybe include the IRA in that. But the weakness of that argument is that Al Qaeda and the sort of terrorist cells, independent terrorist cells, is sort of an innovation and sort of an outlier in terms of their organization, I think. And other organizations are now copying that, right? ISIS sort of used both in their central operations in Syria and Iraq. They were very hierarchical, organized like a military, and close to being even acting like conventional forces, almost to the point where they have a state and have permanent, organized, trained troops who are engaging in sort of pitched battles with enemies, maybe with their own insurgents, right? They're fighting themselves as a conventional army against. And then they also have in Europe, for example, they have cells, independent cells in Europe and also in Egypt and across North Africa. They'll have independent cells, and in Central Asia, independent cells that are acting sort of mostly independently from that central core, but inspired by that central group. So we might not even find that when we start looking at structures and trying to look for clues there for distinctions. It might be possible, right? Are they acting as lone wolves? Are they acting as sort of decentralized cells, or are they acting as a sort of a very hierarchical command structure? That might be one way to distinguish them, but that also has its limits. So yeah, great question. Thank you for that. I'm not sure how much I helped, but I hope that. But I think part of it is that Max Boot doesn't give us a ton to go on that, and I think it's just as interesting, I suppose, not only to see the difference, but maybe to see it as a continuum, right? From sort of your most disorganized terrorists, all the way sort of up through what we might think of more readily as guerrilla warriors, up to maybe conventional forces. That to me was one of the most interesting things, interesting claims that he makes, and it's here on page 138 in bullet point 2. It says, but even tribal peoples such as the Turks, Arabs, and Mongols, who employed guerrilla tactics in their rise to power, turned to conventional armies to safeguard their hard-won empires. Their experience suggests a few people have ever chosen guerrilla warfare voluntarily. It's a tactic of last resort for those too weak to create regular armies. Likewise, terrorism is the tactic of last resort for those too weak to create guerrilla forces. Right, so we have this continuum, but and so maybe that's what makes the question hard is where on the line do we draw? Where do we draw the line, right, along that continuum where we say, okay, now they're guerrillas, okay, now they're terrorists. But some of those things that I suggest maybe help to help us to draw that line, but still it doesn't make it completely clear cut as far as I can tell. So thank you very much, Ariana, for that question. Let's move on to the question by Joseph Davis that says this. And now let me see if I can. Beagle set it up in such a way that it's a bit of a label over the place where I want to read. Okay, the author argues, Max Boot, I guess, that the quick victory methods are not effective for combating insurgencies, but also the public opinion is increasingly important in this age of technology and mass communication. Isn't it true that the length of the campaigns in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan has been a major factor in eroding public support of these conflicts? How do governments find the appropriate balance between the best military strategies and maintaining public support? These two goals appear to be at odds with each other. I think that's an astute observation. Gets a lot of upvotes. How do governments find the appropriate balance? Right, that's a big question. We have a section here on winning hearts and minds, which is often a successful anti-guerrilla strategy. But the thing with that, right, is that winning hearts and minds sounds very. It says here touchy-feely, I suppose. Right, it's not very. It sounds like touchy-feely hearts, minds. But it mentions, I think it mentions Malaysia in here, which the British had some success in. And what they did in terms of winning hearts and minds, what they did was, and so this I think speaks directly to what, how do governments find the appropriate balance between the best military strategies and maintaining public support? One of the classic examples, and it references it here, but I don't think it goes into it too much. It talks about David Petraeus, but here, British, yes, yeah. So a phrase popularized by the British General Gerald Templer. I always like to make Britain relevant again. So, but yeah, this General Templer in Malaysia, I think was the first, or at least credited as the first military commander to employ the strategy of trying to separate the insurgents from the general population, because that's one of the problems when you're fighting an insurgency, is that because guerrilla groups don't wear uniforms to separate themselves from civilians, it's often very hard to tell, right, who are the civilians and who are the insurgents, which can lead to all sorts of problems, right? Because if you're accidentally killing people thinking they're insurgents and they turn out not to be insurgents in the eyes of the public, then public opinion turns against you very quickly, right? You're just slaughtering civilians in that case, and that's a real advantage to the guerrillas. To insurgents, and so General Templer then, one of his strategy, and the thing that he's credited with, and the thing that sort of other people have tried since, because it seemed to work quite well in Malaysia, was to build these whole villages, right? Build villages and invite people to come into the villages and say, if you come here, you'll be protected, you'll be safe. We'll give you, around the clock, robust protection of the British Army. It does actually, going back from Ariana's question, right, going back to that, it does sound very much like some of the tactics suggested in the terrorism article that we already read in the same section. But come into this village. In this village, the British Army, we control this territory. We'll show you how strong we are, how powerful we are, and how we're able to keep you safe and prosperous. Right, and it sort of puts them in competition. Do you want to go over there where the insurgents are? They're not looking after you, and they're not protecting your security. You might die over there, or you might lose your livelihood and your business. And come over here into these villages that we're now protecting and building up and developing, and we'll keep you safe from them. Now, it sort of puts the odds a little bit back in the favor of the British Army, because now we know, okay, if you're coming voluntarily into the villages that we're controlling in order to under our protection, then you're probably not an insurgent, right? Is the idea, I suppose, right? And also we, because we control the villages, we were able to, it would be sort of foolhardy for the insurgents to come and live here, right, and set up camp here. So now we know that the good people are inside these villages, and the bad people are the ones who are not coming. Right? They're the ones who are linked up with the insurgents, right? So it's an attempt to sort out to take the insurgents out of the general population, out of the civilian population, so to avoid this very costly in terms of hearts and minds and in terms of public opinion, very costly mistake of killing the wrong people, or of not killing the right people, right? So you know, the opposite is equally dangerous, right? To assume that they're civilians, and then they end up being insurgents, right? So try and distinguish them. They don't distinguish themselves, and so a state like Britain, the British Army can try and separate them in this way. And this was something that worked well in Malaysia, and something that I think David Petraeus took up in his anti-insurgency campaign as well. So that's one suggestion, I suppose, that's kind of covered, though in a little bit less detail, in the book. That's the idea of winning hearts and minds, but again, not by giving out footballs or candy, but by offering real protection and being able to sort out the insurgents from the general population. Oftentimes insurgencies, they depend on the support of the general population in order to function, right? In order to get supplies and that sort of thing. So yeah, so to separate them out from that support, that's a good way to do it. Yeah, so that's that. That's an answer. I think that's at least the beginning of an answer to that, and so hopefully that's helpful to you. I will get this video up and I'll work on the next module, module 11.